Ernesto just put something in chat here. If you could elaborate further on irrigation prioritization in the advanced options, it would help to frame it with practical examples. How do you actually use it personally, Marcus?
The prioritizations. Yeah.
Irrigation prioritization in the advanced options.
Yeah. So that's a I'm glad you asked that because that definitely needs a lot of attention given to it, in my opinion. It's not very clear. So when you prioritize start time, basically what you're telling the program is that you want to make sure that no matter what happens, no matter what changes it makes, that it's going to start its P1s at the exact same time every day. When you prioritize start VWC on there, it's basically saying that I don't care what my actual start time is. I more care about what specific reading I'm getting on the probe, what VWC reading I'm getting on the probe, um, am I at when I start my day. So for example, if you were like, okay, I want to, in either scenario, you can have a target that you want to start at. So for example, if you had a 60% field capacity, you wanted to dry down 30%, and then you wanted to dry down an additional 2% for your additional dry back the next day, that would give you a starting point in an ideal world of 28% because it's the 60 minus 30 minus 2, right? So when you prioritize start time, the program is going to now modify your irrigation end time the previous or the next day so that it can shift it either forwards or backwards so that when you go through your dry back, you hit your 30% and your additional 2%, that all lines up. So you still hit your 28% target, but it's doing so at that specific start time that you specified. If you were to try to do the same thing, but you chose prioritize start VWC, instead of adjusting your irrigation end time, it's going to adjust your irrigation start time, which means if let's just say you stopped irrigating at a set time the previous day, you dry back, and it turns out that your plants didn't quite drink enough or as fast as you were anticipating, and you were at, say, maybe 35% come that same start time that you wanted to hit, what would end up happening is it would actually wait, and it would wait however long it needed to wait. It could be an hour, it could be 2 hours. And then as soon as you hit that 28% is when it would start. Now, there is something that we want to clear up with that. It is a little misleading because in our previous version of Copilot, like our initial crop steering program, everything was sensor trigger based. And with it being sensor trigger based, that Start VWC, in my opinion, was a much more useful tool because now it was like, okay, I want to make sure I'm waiting real time until I hit this number and it's going off of that live data and now it's going to activate. Because we're on a timer-based system now, it is a little misleading. While it will get you to that point, and it will make sure that it adjusts your irrigation start time, it is always going to be 24 hours behind, right? So essentially, you're trying to achieve the exact same thing with both of them. It's just what are those two separate ways that the program is gonna, what levers can it pull to make that happen? And I do think that that's really, really important to understand is that this is not a sensor trigger start, right? So in my opinion, that's why I always prioritize start VWC is because in my opinion, you're not like the main reason that they said that they will, or the main reason that people liked that previous feature was in like a greenhouse environment, for example, where maybe you had a really cloudy day one day and it your plants just weren't drinking, and because of that, it screwed up the next day's irrigation cycle and it could delay that. Um, that's not how this works in this one. Because it is a timer, it's going to take the data from the previous day and say, well, you didn't actually hit that 28% for 3 hours after where you wanted to start. And so because of that, we're going to shift the next days. So you're always going to kind of be chasing your tail a little bit if you try to use it in that manner. Um, it is good for dialing things in that are stable, like in an indoor environment. Um, but that's why I always recommend start time as the prioritization because no matter what option you choose, it's still trying to hit your targets. It's still, for example, going to hit your 28% when it wants you to start. It's just when is that 28% going to actually fall? And in my opinion, I do think that plants do benefit from circadian rhythm and starting at the same time every day. I also think that it makes it a hell of a lot easier when you're trying to like plan out all of your irrigation events for your facility, so that they're not just randomly happening or shifting all over the place. And then you've got, too much happening or too much flow going on from one pump and it can't handle it. So I do think that scheduling is a big benefit there. And no matter what option you choose, if you do choose the P1 start time, it is still going to prioritize the starting VWC. It's just shifting it in a different way so that it happens, at that set time that you want. Sorry, I hope I answered that one right. It's kind of a hard thing to explain. Maybe it would be better if I showed it on a graph, but if we need to, we can always go back to
Ernesto said, cool.
it. Cool.
But yeah, maybe we can illuminate that a little bit more if we got some time.
Yeah.
Um, there is also P1 interval and P2 quantity.
I'm
Are
not sure.
those
In the
fields you
advanced
can
settings.
lock?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
I was
oh, oh, you just wanted to kind of go through all the advanced options. All right, gotcha. Well, let me go ahead
I'm
and
gonna
just share
pull
my,
it up.
yeah, I'm gonna share my screen. That'll
Yeah,
make it a lot easier then. Let me get in here and I will share.
yeah, no problem, Ernesto. Thank you, bud. We're here for you, man.
Okay, so can you guys see that now?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, cool. All right, so basically, real quick, just to show those things that I was just talking about. So when you select the start time, based on our tooltip here, from what it says, prioritizing your P1 start time, it tells Copilot that you want to make sure that your irrigation events start at a particular time every day, regardless of whether or not the VWC percentage had dropped to your target from your additional dryback target. So quick rundown. I'm not going to go through all that again. You have it set to be 2% here, right? If you have a prioritized set start time, this kind of doesn't matter all that much. It's going to pay attention to what your start time is set at P1 here. And it's going to make sure that in this case at 9 o'clock a.m. every day, it is going to start your irrigations. Now, in the event that I had these P2s here, let's kick those on. I don't know. Yeah, there we go. In the event I have P2s, this line here, this is my irrigation end time, right? This is when the irrigations wrap up for the day. So if I was at if that's going to work, if I was at a set moisture content at this time, in this case, it's like 66. It's not a really good example there. Basically, when I shift this irrigation end time, this is going to change my overall dryback, right? If I pull it back, it's going to make me dry out for longer, and therefore I'm going to get down to a lower point. If I shift it forward, it's going to basically reduce the time I have to dry out, and I'm going to end at a higher VWC reading. And that directly ties in as a loop to the next day here. So when I choose the P1 start time, it is going to change my P3. So for example, if I said I want to be at, in this case, it's 33% VWC at 9 a.m., but my dryback wasn't quite enough to hit that. Instead, like let's just say I was like at 40% right here. The program would literally just, let's just say, shave a couple of these P2 shots off, and it would do the math for you to where your irrigation end time shifted back, giving you more time to dry out so that you actually hit 9 a.m. the next day and you were at the target that you wanted to be. So hopefully that's a little bit clear. Now, if you were to choose irrigation or prioritize start VWC, all it cares about is that you like according to this graph here, not live data, it cares that you're going to start as long as you drive out at the rate that it thinks you are at that set amount. And so in that case, it's going to leave. We're going to go back to how our P2 was, right? This is exactly how it was in that first scenario. Instead, what it's going to do is it's going to say, well, if I keep your irrigation in time the same, I know that you're going to be more so around like 40% here because we didn't give it enough time to dry back. So instead, it's going to push your irrigation in time out the following day. So it's going to say, all right, now we're going to dry back. And of course, it would keep your irrigation in time the same. So it would end up moving it something like that. So this is would be more so what it would look like in that scenario, if that makes sense. So this is a problem, in my opinion, when we do this, because this is a real slippery slope that if you don't keep this stuff in check and we're not actually dialing in when our irrigation in time is, that you might end up with a scenario where you are, let's just see here, you're irrigating at, let's see, 6 p.m. Do one. What'll end up happening is as soon as it updates here, you're going to be running that. And I see this quite a bit where people just kind of let it go unhinged and they don't check it. And then they're just like waiting all day to ramp up. And then they ramp up right before lights off. And then they're drying back. And it's just like this weird cycle that while it works, in my opinion, it's not the best. So hopefully that cleared up the previous question a little bit. But actually going through our advanced options here, that was the start time and the P1 start VWC. But for the advanced options, we've got P1 interval, P1 quantity, disable P2 timer, and field capacity lock. So to start, these first two things, I call them locks, just to be simple. But we've got, and because there's like a locked icon, but basically there's P1 interval and P1 quantity available. And what that's basically saying is we already know the way this program works is it takes what you say in the targets, meaning like, okay, I want a 3% shot size, I want a 15% dry back, stuff like that. It takes these targets and then compares it to the actual data coming in from your sensors and does the math, figures out what changes it needs to make to your actual schedule, your timer events, in order to bring those two closer together. At the end of the day, they want everything to kind of match each other, right? So if you said you wanted a 3% shot, and instead you were giving a 6% shot based on the length of time you have for your P1 duration, it's going to do the math and figure out how much you need to take off of that P1 shot as physical duration to make it go down to 3%. So there's a lot of times where you can you can find yourself in an ideal scenario. I'm gonna actually shift this back. It's kind of throwing me off here. Um, a lot of times you can find yourself in a scenario where you've made some tweaks and changes and you're like, you know what? I feel like I got my P1 sequence really dialed in. I like this. I like how it's going. I like the fact, for example, that I have a 15-minute interval in between. It makes things really, really easy for me to plan out my day with my scheduling. And I know that it gives me just enough time in between my shots so that I can wick properly and I don't, water too soon or I wait all day long by having too long of an interval. If I was to just run this without locking this P1 interval right here, what would end up happening is the program is going to look at what the value I have set here on this targets tab. Because again, that's what it does. It looks at all these target values and tries to make changes based on those. So if, for example, I accidentally set this to 1%, right? And it turns out that it took a long time for my plant to actually register on the sensor and dry back 1%, or make it even more of an extreme, like 2% here. If I did that and it took, let's just say, 2 hours for me to reach 2% dry back, what would end up happening is the next day it's going to start shifting this interval, and before you know it, you might end up with like an out, let's just say like a 50-minute interval in between your shots, which at that point is going to, I'm going to knock this back down just for demonstration's sake. What would end up happening is with the 50-minute interval is, as you can see, it's just dragging it way out throughout the whole course of the day. So that's not really what we want. And I don't like the fact that this would change up on me all the time because then it makes things hard to plan. So if I go in here and I lock this P1 interval, it's basically saying to the program, no matter what I have put into this field under my targets, the ramp up shot dry back, I want you to hold my P1 interval stable at whatever time that I have inputted here. And then it tells the program, it basically says to the program, hey, continue doing what you're doing, continue making all the editations and changes, but when you're figuring out what changes to make, you leave this out of there. So if I lock my P1 interval, it still gives the program the ability to dial in my shot size based on what my target is here, my ramp up shot size. And it also gives me the ability to adjust how many shots I have. So for example, if I have it in this current configuration right here with a P1 interval locked, what I can do is if I changed my dryback, for example, my target overnight dryback from 15 to say 30. If I was to do that and I had that option locked, the program still has complete freedom to fix this scenario right here, right? I need to go up another 15% to get up to my field capacity. Um, but I'm already giving 3% shots. It has those shots dialed in. So if I let's see what's the best way I could say this. If I wanted to recoup that, the best way would be to just add shots in, not try to change the duration or anything like that. I just need to add more shots in. So because I left the frequency unlocked and I left duration on, which there's no lock on duration, the program would still be able to make this change and keep everything dialed in for me. It's just using this 15-minute interval as a constant, if you will. It does not change. Now, the reason I brought up that example is because there's this one right here, P1 quantity. If you lock P1 quantity too, all right, now we're kind of forcing the program. We're basically saying, hey, make the changes that I need to make, but you're not allowed to change the frequency, and you're also not allowed to change the interval, which only gives it one lever to pull, and that's the duration here. And so that's now going to force the program to do something that's mathematically incorrect, right? So if it knows that a 3% shot is 3 minutes, 33 seconds for this specific setup, it's going to say, well, I can't change how many, let's say we're back to six. I can't add more shots in. I can't change the interval or anything. So the only thing I can do is artificially raise our shot duration to get us up to that point. And that's not good. And so when it comes to actual use case with these two, I only recommend ever using one of these at a time, right? So like if you are going to use a P1 interval, which I do, I lock my P1 interval every single time. You need to leave P1 quantity alone, right? Because again, it's just what it says. I guess I kind of skipped over that part. P1 interval locks this interval, P1 quantity locks the frequency. So with that said, you have to give it the option to be able to adjust one of these at a time. You can't lock everything or else you're going to have inaccuracies happen. Um, but the whole point of them is to basically say like, hey, I like this certain thing, or maybe there's some growers who are like, you know what, I like the fact that I have six shots, right? And so it basically it gives you, the grower, the ability to customize how you want the program to modify your schedule for you to still try and hit your targets the best you can. My personal recommendations, though, if you're using this a lot, is I don't really ever lock my quantity. I like to let that be something that the program can manipulate as it needed. I only will lock my P1 interval. Um, or if I did ever want to lock my quantity, I would only lock the quantity and leave the interval unlocked, but I really don't ever use this. Um, Hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't, I can try and clarify. The disable P2 timer here, this is something that let me set this graph up for you guys so I can kind of show you how it would work. Go up to there. Okay. So the disable P2 is exactly what it sounds like. I mean, all of these things are pretty straightforward on what they do. Like this is basically locking your P1 interval. It can't be changed. It's locked your P1 quantity, so the program can't change that. And this is disabling the P2 timer. So when you disable the P2 timer, you are basically telling the program, under no circumstance are you to give me P2s, right? And this is very useful for the first 3 weeks of flower when people are trying to steer generatively and they're trying to stack their EC. We don't want to push runoff in that case a lot of the time. And so if, for example, we had to cut down our field capacity target a bit using that fourth option there, the field capacity lock, and say we had to bring it down and our plant was drinking way more than what we had set here, what would end up happening is it's going to give night shots because we're gonna dry down and we're gonna hit a target that is lower than what our minimum fail-safe value is. And in the event that that happens, it's meant to be a fail-safe. It's meant to be something temporary. That's how it was like programmed in. And so if let's just say we wanted to dry down to 20% or 19.5% here, and we actually dipped below that, say we got down to 18% right around the middle of the night. Okay. Normally, what it would do is it would give those night shots, and then the program would say, okay, I had to give you night shots in the middle of the night starting, and let's just say 2 a.m. here. So what it's going to do is figure out the math of your rate of dry down, and it's going to go in and it's going to add P2 shots so that it ex pushes back, just like this here. So it pushes back your irrigation end time so that you don't dry out past the point right here in the middle of the night. Oh, and notice it's not turning on because I've locked it. Turn that off real quick, just so you can see. So in the event that I dried down too quickly and I gave these overnight failsafe shots right here, the program the next day would add these shots in and push my irrigation end time out so that I did not have to give those night shots the next day. However, and that's normally a good thing. However, in the weeks 1 through 3, we don't want to do that because this means runoff. And if we're not trying to produce a bunch of runoff, this is a bad thing for us. Also, with generative steering, we like to prioritize the most amount of time we can go while with lights on without water, so that we can simulate that drought stress. So if we're giving these irrigation events during the day, in this example right here, we've now spent 60% of the day or more giving water. So that's not really a very big generative stressor. So this is pretty much the only time that we would actually want these fail-safe shots to be had in here. And that's why it was something new that we added in, is because like typically we weren't planning on doing that, but we actually found that it turned out to be a pretty good strategy to running generative, stacking EC, and um, essentially running dry without having to push runoff. So basically what'll happen here is if you have this disable P2 timer activated and you had to give runoff shots or fail-safe shots in the middle of the night, it's going to continue to give those and it's not going to add any P2s here because it knows that this is what you're wanting to do at that time. Um, And as for me personally, I turn this on for weeks 1 through 3. I never don't have this on now that it's available, um, because I don't ever want P2 shots during weeks 1 through 3. Once week 4 rolls around, I come in here and uncheck that. So, and now if I'm giving night shots in weeks 4 through 6, I'm first going to look at my targets to make sure, like, because more normally what I would do is I would increase my dry back at that point to match whatever's happening overnight. But in the event that I'm like, hey, I just can't increase my dry back anymore overnight and I don't want to be giving these night shots, and I have the ability to add more P2s in and extend my irrigation in time, I'm going to let the program do that. Um, do we want to go through the field capacity lock again, or maybe save that till later? I know we've gone over that a few times. I mean, I can, but it'll be a lot more rambling for me right now. So,
Ernesto
uh,
says weeks 1, 2, 3, no P2 shots, lock. Cool tip. Never mind. It is great. Yeah, maybe we can circle back to that here in a second. We got a couple of people who asked a
okay,
few questions, but we can definitely get back to helping Ernesto here in a minute.
yeah,
Sam says, my flower room is in bulk phase, and because the plants are large in 1 gallon quick fill cocoa pots, they dry back very rapidly. As a result, the only way to stay within my target dryback range is to let the failsafe deliver a few small shot irrigations during lights off, even with a final P2 event before dark. I still see more dryback than desired. How detrimental is it to consistently rely on these micro shots during lights off to stabilize substrate moisture? Thanks.
nice. That was actually really um, very relevant to what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
So that's cool. It's not detrimental at all. The I mean, I've ran whole runs just blasting night shots the entire time. The most detrimental thing about giving night shots is that your humidity load is going to go up a little bit depending on how much volume of water you're putting into the room at night. And so if you're in a setup where you're struggling to dehumidify the room and keep it at your target level, that's pretty much going to be the most detrimental thing that's going to happen for you there. Nothing's going to go wrong in my experience with plants giving them shots at night. I mean, we're not sitting there irrigating them and hammering them. You're just giving them, like you said, a couple small micro shots just to keep them above the threshold that you don't want them to go below. Now, what I would like clarification on there is what is the amount of dryback that you are actually having from your last year? I know you said you gave a P2 right before lights off. What is that dryback looking like between that time and lights on the next day in that 12-hour period? Because there's a lot of times where we have these, there's a lot of guides out there. I mean, shit, even the one that we made, it's like, hey, vegetative steer during bulk at that time, we only want a 10% dryback, right? That's like what a lot of people say. That's a typical um, dryback target. And so if it's one of those cases where you're like, oh, it's drinking 10% overnight, I don't want it to go anything more than that. That's why I'm giving night shots. Well, at that point right there, I have changed my thinking on that completely. And I think I said in a other couple previous webinars, my weeks 4 through 6 is I will irrigate all the way up until lights off as long as I am getting a minimum of a 10% dryback. So what that means in your case, when this is very common, if you have basically either a veg time that's too long or just a way too small of a substrate for that specific plant that you're growing, you will run into this issue. It's just drinking like crazy. And in that case, as long as you're irrigating up until lights off, I would just let the plant drink whatever it wants to drink overnight and just match your target dryback to what it can handle in that 12-hour period within some reason, and the reason or within reason, and that reason is how low are you actually going? Because obviously we do not want to let the plant go in most cases below 20% because that's where you're risking bad probe data and that's where you're risking hydrophobic tendencies in your substrate. So as long as it's above 20%, I say let it ride, let it eat. Simply because you're going to just bring in a lot of oxygen at that point. You're not starving the plant. As long as you don't let it go below, like let's just say that 20% minimum, you're not going to risk wilting. It's not going to cause a generative stress. I mean, I've had plants that drink 30% overnight before in a very similar situation to what you have, where I irrigate all day long up until lights off, and they'll still drink 30% by the time the lights come on the next day. That's okay with me. What that tells me, it's not something I want to replicate again and again and again. What that tells me is I either need to decrease my veg time the next run with that specific cut, or I need to increase my substrate size. So if you're in cocoa, it might be time to step up to a 2 gallon. All right. Or if you're in Rockwool, it might be time to stack, or do something like that. Because I mean, I've done runs, like I said, where overnight I irrigate all day, dry out 30% overnight, never once had a bad thing. In fact, they did great. I mean, they're transpiring, they're drinking, they have a ton of oxygen getting pulled in. Never once had a detrimental issue with it. But and if that did happen, the two things I would do look at is like I just said, the veg time and the substrate size. Now, to go back to your question of is it okay to give those night shots? If all of those things I just said don't apply, let's just say you're like, yeah, I have done everything you just said. I irrigate till lights off. It's drinking over 30% and I'm dipping below, my minimum safe threshold that I want to get to, like say below 20%, then yeah, absolutely give those night shots, let it hold where it needs to be. Um, and I mean, I'd give night shots all night if I had to. I have, and it's not a problem. So I wouldn't worry about it hurting your grow one bit, I guess. So how I should say that.
He just followed up and said, I shoot for a 10 to 15% dryback relative VWC during bulk. I believe my issue is too small of a substrate for my plant size. So he concurs.
Yeah, but also. I mean, just my opinion, I don't think it will hurt them either to increase that dryback. So, and you could eliminate it that way too.
Cool.
So,
Let's see here. Greg's asks, how would you deal with intervals not overlapping with multiple rooms? If you could only run two rooms at a time in, say, a 14 room facility.
um, are we, I mean, well, there's, I guess, two means of that. I don't know if it really matters much. One would be direct inject and one would be off batch tank. Either way, you've got a max number of valves that you can run at the same time due to either pressure or flow. That's where, well, two things. One is that's where those prioritizations that I have that I recommend, meaning start time and locking my P1 interval, that's going to make things as easy as you possibly can get when it comes to scheduling appropriately so that these are the same every day, right? Like when my shots start is the same, and how many times, or what the interval is that they're going on. It makes things a little bit easier. Um, we also have the ability to see when overlapping valves are occurring. So you can kind of go in and say like, okay, well, the max number of valves I want to run at any given time is this number, and the program should, let's see, of course, in this example, there is nothing that's actually overlapping. I can go to maybe a different room, but basically it'll highlight in red lines when things are overlapping. But at the end of the day, apart from smart scheduling, um, which can be a real pain, especially in a 14 room facility. We do have irrigation queuing. It is in beta. It does work well, but it is something that we have to manually activate for you if you qualify based on the setup that you have. It does work with direct inject and it does work with batch tanks, and it's for Copilot programs specifically. So if there was like, for example, you say, oh, the max number of zones that I can feed on a given pump or out of my fertigation skid is this, we can just set that number. Um, on the back end that says like, hey, at any given time, if you have more than four valves open and more valves kick on at that time, place those in a queue to immediately open once the other ones are done. And so you kind of makes it to where the guesswork's not quite so intense. You still would want to, even if you were running that, you would still want to try and schedule everything for the most part. And that way, really, as long as your P1 sequences are pretty rock solid, and not, crazy overlapping every day, slightly staggered, then really it's just your P2s and potential overnight fail safes that are going to be what's going to collide and duplicate. And so at that point, it becomes something very easy for our irrigation queue logic to handle for you. And that would be something that you would reach out to me for privately. So what I can do is go over your setup with you, make sure it's going to work because there are a few limitations sometimes depending on the equipment that you have in your room on whether it can or can't work. Um, but as long as you're good on that front and you've got everything that you need, then we can go ahead and get that set up for you.
All right. Doug asks, how does Growlink assist with flush/ripening stage?
So flush/ripening stage can be different for a lot of people. Ripening stage is usually week 7 and 8, or if you're running a 9 weeker, it's usually weeks 8 and 9. Flush for some people is 3 days, for some people it's a week, for some people it is the full ripening stage. Um, Copilot is going to help, and when you say Growlink, and I'm assuming you're running Copilot in that regard, but the way that it's not going to know you're in a flush stage, that's where you have to come in and set your targets. So if you're trying to flush, um, usually when people flush at the end of flower during ripening, they're not just pushing a shitload of runoff with the same EC, they have lowered their nutrients. They're feeding at straight RO, pH RO, or they're going down to a significantly reduced EC feed at that point. So really, you shouldn't have to change too much. You would still give your P1s in the same regard. You'd still give your P2s if you're pushing that extra runoff. Basically you're matching everything that you normally would be doing. You're just changing up your input feed at that point, if that's what you're meaning. Um, if you need to flush more, like physically get the substrate down quickly, you can come in and enable this little flush timer right here. And essentially what this is, it's the programmable final P1. So right at the end of my P1 sequence, the reason we did that is because it is at your wettest point. You have given your final P1, you've hit field capacity. So any water you put in at this point immediately is going to pretty much channel or flush right through the substrate. And so we gave you essentially, it's like a one final P1, and you can make that as long as you want it to be. And you can run that by itself right here and not sacrifice your dry back, which I do believe is important in ripening phase. I do go for a 30% dry back in week 7 and 8. So if I wanted to run my P1s all the way up, get to field capacity, and then hit a flush and really get shit knocked out of there and then do my full dry back, this would be the way I would do that. Or if you're running P2s too, because you're just drying back too much, at the end of flower, you can, and the flush is still going to stay in its same spot. You're going to get up to field capacity. It's going to flush out the substrate, and then you're going to continue to give your P2s throughout the day to keep the substrate wet to a certain time to modulate your dry back, and it's going to give you additional runoff at that point. So hopefully that answers that for you.
Cool. Ernesto also had a follow-up here. Also, in this matter, when you mention a 10% absolute minimum nighttime dryback, does this apply regardless of the substrate saturation point in cocoa? Example, from 60% to 50, 50 to 40, 40 to 30.
Yeah, the dry back has nothing to do with what the max saturation point is or field capacity, whatever term we want to use there. 10% means 10% of whatever you got. And when it comes to absolute, it means just straight subtraction. So if you got up to 60, 60%, and then you wanted a 10% absolute dry back, it would go down to 50. If you were doing a relative 10% dry back, then I don't have the ability to do the math right now in my head, but it would be what is 10% of 60? What is that? 6%. That would be the actual dry back. So it would go from 60 down to 64 or 54%. So yeah, when I say 10%, I do mean absolute, and it does not matter where you're coming from. So if it's at 50, we're going from 50 to 40. If it's at 60, we're going from 60 to 50. It really shouldn't, your field capacity at that point in the run during bulk should never be lower than 50. If it is, we need to do some sensor placement adjustments. So that's why I was saying, like if we keep our top end at 50 as a minimum at field capacity, then at no point should you really ever go below 20. Even if I was irrigating, like say we're in bulk, and I don't know how many I'd have to put here. Let me make this an hour. Recalculate real quick and see. And then I can show you. Okay, cool. So let's just say I'm irrigating, I'm in weeks 4, weeks 5 here. I get up to my field capacity, I'm irrigating all the way up roughly till lights off, and then I'm drying out here. If I have this at a minimum of 50, that gives me a full 30% window still, just like I had in weeks 1 through 3, to dry out whatever I need to without causing any type of stress. Stress to me is caused, or from what I've seen, drought stress is caused when your lights are on. That's the time when the plant is needing the water, it's photosynthesizing, it's transpiring, it's using all of that. The nighttime, it's the load is not nearly as high. It can go the whole night without water. That's not a stress at all. So even if it's 20% that happens over here, as long as it got irrigated all day long and you got up to 50, it should be just fine, right? So I wouldn't worry about that.
Perfect.
Yeah, hopefully that answered that.
Yeah, Ernesto, let us know if you have anything else you want to talk about there, buddy. Um, Marcus, I don't know if there's anything else in Copilot right now since we're in here that kind of worth a bear repeating.
Um, I don't know. I mean, I could go back into the field capacity lock again, but that's something I was going to probably cover when we release the guide and kind of walk through everything with it.
Nice.
So, um,
Doug asks, do you add all your P2s at day 22?
yeah. So, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be day 22, but yeah, whenever I've determined that stretch is done, some plans take a little longer than others and some are shorter. Whenever you have determined that stretch is done, yeah, my official transition is to, I like in a normal scenario, I would be looking just like this as soon as it updates, where was giving my 11.3% P1s, drawing back 30%. So this is usually what I'm looking like right around day 21, day 22. And so when I want to make that shift, the first thing I'm going to do is change my dry back total. And depending on what the plant is drinking overnight, is usually what I'll set it to. So I'll look at the graph. I'll say, okay, in this case, at 8 o'clock p.m., I'll take a note of what my VWC reading is at that point, and I can look at my previous day's data and find this. So if it's at 29%, and then I go down here and I say, okay, it's at 20%, that tells me that I'm around a 9% dryback overnight. So in that case, I would just come into my overnight dryback and set that to 10, right? I'm going to match it. And again, this is what I was saying. I want my minimum to always be 10. If this is not 10, we're going to pull back some of these P2s. But let's just assume in this case it is. So if this was a 10% dryback, I would shift my overnight dryback target to 10. And now we can see I don't need all of these P1s anymore. And the program will do this for me, but I like to come in and just do it myself and just kind of get it a day in advance. So I'm going to remove a couple of those. Show you how did that happen? 3%. Huh, weird. I guess I'll go less than that. 5%. Yeah, anyway, so I'll basically match my P1s going up to what I'm going down, and then I will add my P2s in, like you just said, all the way up till lights off. However, I need to do that. Looks like I'll have to do 9 of them here. There we go. So it'll look just like that. And as long as I'm able to dry out 10% overnight, this is what I shoot for. The only time that I would ever remove some of these P2s off is if this is not 10% overnight. Now, and I run that way all through weeks 4 through 6. I will give them irrigations all the way up. I basically make my irrigation in time either right at lights out or right before lights out. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm irrigating throughout most of the day. And then if this level, like I've kind of just went over, if this level goes above 10% anymore, even though I'm irrigating all the way up to lights off, all I'm doing at that point is just matching my target to whatever that is. So if this happens to, if my plant, I'm irrigating the lights off and it starts drying out to 15% overnight, I'm just going to update my target to 15 because that's what that plant is drinking. And the program will usually take care of the rest at that point. It's going to allow me to add in a couple more P1s because we're going down farther, which means we need to go up farther. So yeah, and that's what would end up happening, the shift from day 21 to um, week one, or I'm sorry, week 4 in bulk. Another note I'll say, just kind of unrelated, is when you are doing that transition, it's very helpful if you have the ability to, when you are making all these shifts and adjustments, to go in and do a manual hand watering with a wand. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. I usually will just kind of go by real quick and do like if I'm just going to do one pass, I'll do like 15 seconds in a pot or somewhere around there just to really get it nice and rehydrated again. Because again, we're running pretty dry and there are definitely going to be parts that have gone hydrophobic at some point. So that allows you to regain lost field capacity and really make sure that this is an accurate number here for the remainder of the run. And it also is going to really get your EC down and flushed out pretty quick, which is important because um, if you try to ride vegetative steering targets and all of that through weeks 4 through 6, and your EC is just way too high, the plant will start burning. Its leaves will look like shit by the time you get to week 7. So it is important to get it flushed down. It doesn't have to be all the way completely flushed out, but it needs to be within usually like 1 to 2 EC above what your input feed is.
Uh, he also had asked a follow-up question here. Does the number of P2s change through bulks versus finishing, or does the number of P2s stay fixed, but the volume of each P2 increases over time?
So that's a double edge there. So in any time, regardless of whether it's in bulk or finish, your size of your P2s is directly proportionate to how many P2s you have, right? Because if you're doing small P2s, you're going to need more of them because they're always the dry back is equated to the shot size, right? Like you got to have if you dry back, if you give a 3% shot, you have to wait until you dry back 3% because we're trying to maintain a set number. So if I wanted to dry back 8%, then I'm going to give an 8% shot, right? And so whatever that amount is going to change the physical number of P2s for the most part. And we increase and decrease that to manage our EC through runoff. Um, However, the amount so you have that as the first factor. So it's like how big are my shots? That's going to determine how many you can squeeze into a set period of time. And that period of time is going to be set based on what you want your dry back to be. So because we're not going for a maximum dry back in weeks 4 through 6, we're pretty much giving P2s all day long. And when we get into week 7 and 8 and ripening, I care about my dry back a hell of a lot more than, and I always want a 30% dry back. So the only time that my numbers will physically change is if I need to pull back some. So if I'm not drinking 30% overnight by week 7 or in when I go into week 7, then I will usually, remove, and the program does this for you based on your target. If I put my overnight dry back target to 30, it's going to get rid of some of the P2s so that you have your 30% dry back at that point. So those are two factors that are going to change, throughout the grow, how many P2s you have, what your total P2 window is, and how many you can squeeze in there, or how many you want to space out in there at that point.
Perfect. It's here. Tom just had a quick question. Yep, the Zooms will be posted later. Mikey, can you, where are we putting it? We're putting up on YouTube, right?
Yeah, they'll be on YouTube usually within 24 hours.
There you go. Let's see here. This next question is in German, so I just translated it. What happens if you don't reach 10% during the night phase?
Yeah, and bulk of flower weeks 4 through 6, if you do not reach 10% during the night phase, you're going to want to remove some of the P2s from the day phase. The further, just like I just did here, so let's say I have 6 P2s here and I'm not drinking 10% in this time, I'm going to knock that down to 4 P2s, which it should do here in just a sec. And now I have just given myself more time during the lights on to increase that dry back total. And so if you will basically decrease and remove, you will remove P2s and decrease your irrigation in time and pull it back earlier in the day to allow your plant more time to dry out. And that's how you're going to get your 10%. Usually by the time that if you have done everything, if you've had a solid stretch and you've built a good stable root mass, you usually will not have an issue at that. But if you've got a problem with roots, root health and oxygenation, or just something stunted, or whatever's going on with the room, it can be a very helpful thing to do to ensure that you're getting enough oxygen in there.
Perfect. Let's see here. Ryan Young asks, will there be or is there a way to configure Copilot P1s to get precise amounts of runoff percentages in the future?
Um, well, without having some form of device linked to it to actually measure physical runoff, no, you're never going to get that precise. But we do a pretty damn good job of, you know, honing in volume. And when I say volume, I mean the duration, just like you would without a sensor. Like you have a rough idea of what your substrate volume is going to be. You have a rough idea of how much water mLs you're actually pushing out with your drippers or your rings or whatever you've got. And we can kind of do a rough percentage-based volume calculation at that point, which is how we come up with a lot of like our initial things. But once we get rocking and rolling, we're actually just moving straight to sensor data. And so like we'll take an average of our P1s and we'll say, okay, so because every time you could give this 3 minute, 33-second shot 6 times throughout the day, and every single time it's not going to be the same percentage. That's just not how water wicks. It's not how it works inside the substrate. It's all over the place. And that's why we'll say like, okay, during this P1 phase, we know we had 6 shots. We're going to find the mean of that. We're going to take all of them. We're going to average them out and find out what the average shot size was spaced out because water takes on differently from a dry substrate than it does a wet substrate. So we get pretty close with that now. And if you have properly set up your P1s, you shouldn't really be getting any runoff in your P1 phase up until the last couple shots. Basically, any shot you give within like I've said before, a 5 to 10% window of your field capacity line up here. So really, if there's, in this case, it would just be like 1 or 2 shots that could potentially give us runoff. But if you were giving a whole bunch of small ones, you could maybe the last 3 shots or so. Anything in that window is where you're going to get that runoff. And when you properly tune your P1s, you should be roughly getting around 10 to 15% total volume runoff coming out of that. And that's just something you're going to observe when you're getting this stuff dialed in the room. I mean, you could take your measurements if you want, but usually it's like you only got to measure it once. And you're like, okay, based on this timer sequence here, and I give my P1s, I can expect to get around 10 to 15% runoff by the time I'm done with my P1s. Um, and so at that point, if you ever needed to increase that, I would do so with a flush because it's an extended P1 instead of just adding more and more P1s past your fuel capacity line. Because that's just, I mean, they do the same thing. It's just you can kind of get it all knocked out if you're aiming for a certain volume. But usually, when we're running runoff, like if you're only giving P1s, like an early flower, we don't typically want a shitload of runoff. We're trying to stack EC, and once we get our EC to a certain point, we're wanting to hold it at that level, which means I don't want to flush it down with runoff, but I also want to give it just enough runoff to where it doesn't continue to rise up to a bad level for my plant. So usually that 10 to 15% that we get off the finals here, final P1s, that's like the sweet spot to kind of hold it at a stable level. Maybe it goes up slightly or maybe it goes down slightly, depending on your setup. Um, but at any time other than that, we're giving P2s. And that's where we're going to really try to go for the remainder of the runoff that we want throughout the day. So if I can guarantee that I'm going to get 10 to 15% runoff from a properly set up P1 sequence, now I can tune these P2s to add on to that however much I want. So if I want a total of 30% for the day, then I know I can get 10 to 15 out of the P1 and then I'll go and shoot for another 15 or 20 from my P2s. And if I want to step that up more, I can just increase. I can basically make these shots smaller and more frequent throughout my P2 phase to increase my total volume of runoff that's going to occur.
Perfect. All right, we are about at the end of our time. Just want to give everyone just another minute here in case they got a follow-up question to any of that. But Marcus, thanks a lot, man. Great stuff today.
Yep.
Perfect. All right, everybody. Thanks again for showing up. Going forward, yeah, we're just going to be sticking to Zoom. So this should be the same link for next week or for the next session and in perpetuity, unless we have to change something for some reason, which I don't see happening. So, yeah, appreciate all you. Hope you guys grow some great stuff over the next couple of weeks, and we'll talk to you soon.